Hi guys, I hope you're doing well. And in this video, we're going to be discussing about the disadvantages of free trade. Now, in the previous video, we saw how free trade is actually beneficial for developing and developed economies, and what are the different merits or benefits of free trade that can result to firms and the economy overall, and the consumers and the producers as well. Now, as far as we say that yes, free trade is beneficial to an economy, we also agree on the fact that there are some disadvantages of free trade. So, guys, if a question comes in your past paper, this is often tested in the past paper that discuss whether or not free trade is always beneficial. Now, it's an 8-mark question that usually comes in the past papers, is always beneficial. So, for such a question, you need to first define what free trade is, and we've already discussed that in the previous video. And then, free trade is basically international trade without any trade barriers. There's no trade barriers imposed by the government. So if you're writing that yes, free trade is beneficial, so you need to support your answer that why is it beneficial. But then obviously you also need to mention that free trade is not always beneficial, right? It has some disadvantages as well. There are some cons of free trade as well. But remember that when we talk about disadvantages of free trade, we are talking about disadvantages of free trade that is without any trade barriers. Without any trade barriers, which means that free trade is taking place, there is no trade barriers, there is no trade protection, which means that we can also call it uncontrolled trade. As in, the government is not intervening, there are no tariffs, no quotas, no embargoes, and there is total free hand to import and export whatever and however and whatever quantity you want and whatever type of goods you want. So obviously this will have a negative impact on the economy. We will be discussing that in this video. So make sure that you watch the video till the end. And if you haven't subscribed to my channel, make sure that you also click the subscribe button. Moving forward, guys, free trade, yes, it is advantages, but the first disadvantage that you will mention in the exam is about the infant industry argument. Now, infant industries are basically your domestic firms, right? These are those firms that are in their infant stage. You can also call them sunrise firms, that are basically small firms and they haven't grown too large right now, but they have a potential to grow large. When we talk about infant firms or sunrise firms, you're talking that that they are in their growing phase and they still haven't been able to fully exploit their absolute or competitive advantage. What I'm trying to say over here is that these sunrise firms have a potential to actually become big one day and then bring a lot of benefits to the country by exporting and also serving to the domestic economy. So they have a potential competitive and absolute advantage. But the problem is that if you allow free trade, then if you allow imported products into the domestic economy, people would prefer those imported products instead of buying from domestic firms. Because obviously, imported products are usually dumped, right? So basically, what is dumping? Dumping is an act where foreign firms actually sell their products in the domestic economy at a very low price or even below their cost of production. And I'll make you write that, don't worry. So basically, dumping is when the foreign firms are selling their products in the domestic economy. Like China has dumped a lot of products in the Asian markets in the electronic industry, electronic products. And that is why we see wherever we go in the electronic market, it is fully flooded by Chinese products because these are good quality products that are sold at a very low price. And our domestic firms, especially our sunrise and sunset firms, sunrise firms are those firms that are in their growing stage. Sunset firms are those firms that are in their declining stage, but both are covered in the infant industry argument. So these firms basically are not able to sell the product at a very low price because they can't cover their cost at the price at which the foreign firms are dumping their products, right? But these sunrise firms do have a potential and absolute advantage and if they won't be protected by the government, then foreign firms will just keep on dumping their products, and it will just ultimately what will happen is that our domestic firms will have to close down because they can't survive the competition against foreign firms. So what we are saying is that those sunrise firms that are in their infant stage will be negatively affected because of international competition, because they won't be able to survive against foreign firms. Why? Because you need to also tell that foreign firms are competitive and they are efficient. They are huge firms. And these huge firms, especially firms in China, they benefit from significant economies of scale. And they are also large firms. Obviously, if you're benefiting from economies of scale, your average cost would be low. Obviously, that reduces your average cost. And they transfer the low cost benefit to the consumers as in the form of low prices. You could also call this act as, like I said, dumping, right? Dumping is when foreign firms are actually dumping their products at a very low price or even below cost of production. So one question would be, if your cost is, let's suppose $10 and you're selling a product at, let's say, $5, So you're incurring a loss. So why would foreign firms incur a loss? Because like I said, these are large firms. If they have enough profits to help finance those losses. So even if they're having losses, but they will still, the benefit would be that they have a lot of cash and liquidity and profits at their back to actually support those losses or finance or fund those losses. So even if they are at a loss, they are at a loss only temporarily, right? And their aim is to actually throw those domestic firms out of business, to shut down the infant industry, and so that they can dominate the market and they can emerge in those markets, right? And they can capture those markets in the domestic firms, and like China did in Pakistan, right? So again, this would be a problem, right? Also remember that foreign competition also makes it difficult for sunset firms to survive and brings their decline much faster. Now, what are sunset firms? Sunset firms are those firms that are inefficient and they are in their declining stage. They're about to close down, right? Because they're inefficient, they're uncompetitive, they can't maybe they produce at a very high cost. Now the problem is that these foreign firms bring a lot of foreign competition, and consumers are preferring those foreign products, and who will buy from these domestic firms? So especially so although if the sunset firms were to close down in the next 3-4 years, they might maybe close down in the same year, or maybe just a year after these foreign products are flooded or dumped in the domestic economy. So it basically makes their decline much faster. And the problem is that if our infant industry is shut down, if the sunrise and sunset firm shuts down because they can't compete against the foreign firms, the problem is that it will result into massive unemployment. There will be massive unemployment. Remember that. And such an unemployment would be basically known as structural unemployment. And this would have huge negative consequences on the economy because your entire industry is shutting down, right? And that is shutting down because it has a huge cost that it can't cover up and it can't meet, because the international competition is selling its products at a very low price, and our domestic firms can't compete with that low prices because they have very low cost. Maybe they are using advanced technology. Maybe they have high labor productivity. Their labor is very efficient, right? And that is why they have that advantage, which our domestic firms don't have, right? So, but again, the whole problem is that it would result into massive unemployment, huge levels of structural unemployment. And what will our domestic labor do then if the industry is shut down? Also, you could mention that if and this will severely hit developing countries, because if the multinational firms of the developed economies, they come and they dump their products in developing countries or poor countries, right? And those domestic firms of our poor countries, they can't compete and they shut down, then it will result into huge levels of unemployment and poverty. And we know that if there's huge poverty, then the government have to support basically have to support unemployment through providing unemployment benefits and transfer payments, which has an opportunity cost as well, right? So remember that domestic firms, they face a high average cost, right? They have a high cost of production because maybe they're using expensive raw material, maybe they have a high cost, maybe because there's cost push inflation in the economy. So if our inflation is very high, then our domestic firms would suffer from high cost, and obviously our prices would be high. On the other hand, maybe the inflation rate in those developed economies where these multinationals operate, they have very low rates of inflation because their economy is more stable. They have more stable prices, right? Maybe cost of production could be high, maybe because we have huge levels of indirect taxes imposed by our government, right? Or maybe our wage rates are very high, because these are some of the important factors that determine the level of cost in our economy, right? So remember that if the domestic prices are high, and so in that case, the problem is that if our domestic firms are suffering from high prices, the domestic consumers would import, right? So imports would go up, right? Um, and because those imports are of high quality and they are selling it at a low price, because maybe they are dumping their products in domestic markets. So basically, yes, consumer welfare would rise because consumers would benefit, but then again, we don't have to only consider from the consumer's perspective. We also have to consider, the government considers benefits and then compares it with cost as well, because the government has to do rational decision making. Obviously, the problem is that domestic firms would suffer tremendously because of it, right? Remember also that, like I said, that foreign firms also practice dumping, which is which is a huge threat to the domestic industry. Huge threat. Remember to mention dumping. So basically, what dumping is when foreign firms sell their product below their cost of production or at a very low price to capture the foreign markets, right? So if China dumps their products in Pakistan, right? Because they want to capture the market in Pakistan, and they have been successful in doing so. Also remember that if domestic firms shut down, like I said, it would. So if firms shut down, not only will it increase unemployment, but it will also lower GDP and output. So our GDP and output would go down, right? Unemployment would increase poverty levels. It would result into poor living standards. It would even reduce our GDP per capita, that is income per head. Also remember that if domestic firms shut down, because obviously our imports are rising, right? And we are consuming foreign products. So if let's say our imports are going up, so it will result into a negative balance of trade on the current account as well. And if our domestic firms shut down, it would also lower our tax revenues. So our sales tax revenues would fall. Our income tax revenues would also fall because income tax is generated from people who are working. So if the industry shut down, then less income tax would be generated, right? If consumers spend more on foreign products, then less sales tax revenue from domestic products would be generated. If firms shut down, then corporate tax revenues would fall as well. And we know that if tax revenue goes down, there is a tendency that now we would incur a budget deficit. You know what a budget deficit is? Budget deficit is a situation where the government spending is greater than our tax revenues. And if the government spending is greater than tax revenue, then the government has to borrow to fund the government's spending, right? Because there's a budget deficit now. So if the government is planning to spend 2.2 million, right, while the tax revenue is only 1 million, so we have a deficit of 1 million now, right? And this deficit will be financed or funded through maybe borrowing. And if you borrow money to fund this deficit, it increases your national debt, right? It increases your national debt, right? And if you borrow especially from, let's say, IMF and World Bank, that increases your external debt as well, right? It increases your external debt as well. So guys, this is it. So moving forward, we have some further disadvantages that maybe, for example, if you could also write that, for example, because the problem is that if you have free trade and this free trade is totally uncontrolled, right? It's totally uncontrolled. You don't have any restrictions on the quantity of imports. What goods are you importing? If you are importing demerit goods, that also has a negative impact on welfare society, right? So if our imports are rising because of free trade, that would result into a fall in the value of the currency as well. It would result into currency depreciation. Why? Because obviously what would happen is that the supply of the currency would actually increase, and that would basically reduce the value of the currency. Now, I wouldn't be going a lot detail on this point because we will cover this point in exchange rate as well. But remember that when the imports are rising, it increases the supply of the currency, and the supply of the currency goes down, the external value of the currency. Sorry, when the supply of the currency goes up, the external value of the currency goes down. So increase in supply of currency would reduce the value of the currency basically depreciates. Now, all this we will go later on when we will cover the exchange rate mechanism, we will cover in the exchange rate lessons, right? So hang on till we go over there. But yes, those videos will also be posted on my channel. Also remember that if you're importing, so you're importing high quantity of raw material. Let's say if you're importing, and let's say if you're importing key raw materials such as oil, and if you're importing this raw material from, let's say, from other countries who are suffering from cost push inflation, right? So now those countries are suffering from cost push inflation that drives up the raw material prices in their countries. But since you're importing those raw materials, so it also brings cost push inflation in your country as well, because now you will be importing raw material at expensive rates. But the problem is that you don't have any other option because the demand for raw material is maybe inelastic, because you're importing, let's say, key raw materials, key commodities, essential raw materials, right? So it would bring cost push inflation in your country, and cost push inflation is not good for your country because it results in structural unemployment, since cost of the industry would go up, and then it would be difficult for firms to survive because labor would actually demand higher wages then to streamline their cost of living. Because if you're suffering from inflation, then workers will constantly demand for higher wages. Some will be successful while some others may be unemployed in that case. Also remember the fact that like I said, international trade, especially especially when you have more international trade, when there's more global trade taking place. It's so also, it's not only about the developing country, but also remember that increasing global trade and competition, increasing global competition, especially from rapidly developing economies, is also threatening many established businesses in developed economies. Not only the established businesses in developed economies, and new and small businesses who are trying to grow in many less developed economies. So what I am trying to say is that established businesses may then lose market share, or maybe they may be even forced to close if they cannot compete with larger overseas businesses, or maybe new businesses in low cost economies. So what I am trying to say is that established businesses that are established in domestic economies, they may lose business. They may eventually be forced to shut down because, and even if they are in developed economies, right, they may even shut down as well. So, and maybe small businesses in poor countries or less developed economies may also be unable to grow themselves on a large scale, because the consumers in those countries are importing goods from abroad that are far more cheaper than the locally made products, right? So yeah, so these are some of the disadvantages these are some of the disadvantages for free trade, but these are not the only disadvantages. We have some more to cover as well. Also remember, there is one severe disadvantage that arises because of uncontrolled trade, and that is that international trade, especially when we're talking about international trade has caused us, it has caused rapid resource depletion. It has caused rapid resource depletion because now the whole idea is to grow, to create wealth, and nations are competing amongst each other in terms of wealth generation and who has a high GDP, right, than the other country. So obviously and for that, they don't give a damn about the environment. They try to make their industries successful, industries grow, and for that, the entire ecosystem of the earth is getting disturbed because there's a rapid level of resource depletion. And this has also contributed to huge levels of climate change, which has a negative impact on climate. And again, this is part of the negative externality. So the earth's natural resources are increasing. So the rate at which we are using up the earth's natural resources is increasing, right? Because the earth is not prepared for it. The earth was never prepared for this, right? And that is why it has disturbed the entire ecosystem and is significantly contributing to climate changes in a much negative manner. Yeah, and that has caused welfare damages to society. We have seen Amazon fires taking place. We have seen flooding taking place. We have seen global warming taking place, right? So yeah, there has been global climate changes, and the impacts on the climate are disastrous. Not only they are disastrous, they are irreversible and they are long term. So climate change is a big thing. It's not a small thing. The damages to climate that have taken place because of growth, because of international trade and countries trying to compete to be the best. So for that, they just need to produce more output and generate more wealth. So that changes have been disastrous, they have been long term, and they have had an irreversible impact on Earth, right? Also remember, there's one more disadvantage that may take place when you're talking about international trade. That international trade may also result into increase in the increase in the exploitation of workers and the environment, right? Increase in exploitation of workers in the environment, although the environment part is a bit connected to the previous part. But the problem is that there's free movement of capital internationally. Free movement of capital internationally means that, a company may set up its operations in another country, it may set up its operations in several countries. If I want to invest, I am free to invest in other countries. And basically the entire idea is to just generate more wealth and create more incomes on international levels as well. But then the problem is that so free movement of capital has basically allowed multinational firms to invest in other countries. So maybe in Pakistan, maybe a Chinese company may come and invest in Pakistan, and that sort of an investment is known as FDI. FDI is when MNCs come and they set up their operations in domestic economies. Although yes, multinationals is very good and it has very good impacts on the economy and in GDP, but then again, remember that there are some disadvantages as well. And the problem is that these multinational firms, these international multinational firms, they're actually shifting their production from countries where wages are high to less developed countries where wages and these land prices and taxes are actually lower. So basically, multinational firms who have already had their operations for a long time in developed countries are actually moving out of developed countries. They're actually coming and investing in developing countries and poor countries because of low wage cost. First of all, maybe low land prices, and also maybe these poor developing countries or less developed countries. So developing and less developed is the same. So you could also write, so poor, less developed and developing countries, they don't have strong environmental laws. First of all, they don't have strong health and safety laws. They don't have strong regulations, and all of that significantly may reduce the cost of production for these multinationals and may give them an attractive incentive to come and establish their operations in these poor countries to take advantage of lower cost. But then again, the problem is that these multinational companies they exploit domestic workers. So they pay them less because already the wage rate is too less in developing countries. So if the same product was being made in a developed country, they would have been paying their workers over there a high wage rate, because over there the wage rate is high. Even the minimum wage rate is very high in developed countries. But in poor countries, the minimum wage rates are low as well. So if you're making the same product in a developing country, you're paying their labor a lower wage, while the same product with the same ingredients are being produced abroad, and you're paying your workers a much higher wage rate. So it's kind of comes under the umbrella of exploitation. And you ask, and also we know that in poor countries the health and safety laws are less, and the health and safety laws may be more relaxed, and they are more easier to ignore by these multinational firms as well. And also, the governments of these poor countries cannot say much to these developed multinationals because they are providing employment in the poor countries. They're also significantly contributing to tax revenues, and they are significantly contributing to employment and GDP as well. So, and like I said, that the multinationals of these developed countries, when I said that they are shifting their operations to poor countries, the problem is that one of the problem is that has actually caused unemployment in developed nations as well. That has caused unemployment in developed nations, because now if I am a multinational firm, and let's say if I am in the USA, then if I want to move to a poor country, maybe I don't know, country A, then the problem is that if I move my entire operations to country A, then it would create massive unemployment in USA, right? So this is another problem. Because that is why we say, because when we're talking about, guys, remember, when we're talking about international trade, it does not only involve import and export, because international trade has a whole new dimension the international trade is a whole new dimension because of globalization. So it's not only about just importing and exporting goods. International trade also includes MNCs establishing their setups in other countries. It also includes movement of labor from one country to other in search of better jobs. So a lot of things come under international trade when we're talking about when we're seeing international trade as a whole, rather than just international trade concerning import and export of goods, right? So also the fact that international trade has also resulted into increase in gap between rich and poor countries. Right, so there has been an increase in gap between the rich and the poor countries. Why? Because the problem is that so you could write in the exam that some economists argue that if the trade will be free, so it will. So although yes, we agree that free trade is beneficial, and free trade is very beneficial for developing and poor countries, because because it helps lift the poor countries out of poverty, because they're obviously selling their goods abroad, and that helps them bring in a lot of foreign exchange and foreign currency reserves, and helps the firms to grow, and it also promotes their export industries. It helps create a lot of employment levels as well. So yes, it is important for the population of the poor countries. Yes, free trade is important. It is important for these poor countries to grow and to increase their exports and generate more export revenue, so that they can lift their economy out of poverty. But then so there's a direct argument against this concept as well. Some of the economists will say, yes, it is important for free trade to, especially for developing economies, so that they can lift themselves out of poverty. So if you talk about these poor countries, so what will help these poor countries? Is it international trade? Is it exports that will help them, or is it overseas aid? So if you want to lift, so some economists may argue that if you want to help these poor countries grow, then it is not international aid or foreign aid by the IMF and the World Bank and the United Nations that will help these poor countries out of poverty. It is international trade. It is rise in international trade, rise in their exports, right? Maybe some of the firms in these poor countries set up their operations abroad as well. And then when they make profits abroad, they repatriate those profits back into the poor countries. And then, so the point what we're trying to say is that yes, international trade helps these poor countries, but at the same time, there is also a problem, or you can say that some economists also argue that it has led to an increase in the gap between the rich and the poor countries. So the gap between the rich and the poor countries has widened. And the reason that you can give is that a lot of rich countries dominate. A lot of rich countries basically dominate the global demand for many natural resources. They dominate the global demand for many natural resources, such as copper, timber, maybe foodstuff, maybe oil as well. So the problem is that this has reduced the revenues for the producers of the natural resources in less developed economies. And so the problem is that if there is a country, let's say this is a country and this is the poor country. So, and this is, let's suppose, the developed nations who globally dominate the demand for natural resources. So other countries, the other countries would actually import natural resources from these countries rather than importing, natural resources from the poor countries, because they have a monopoly, right? They dominate the global export of natural resources. And if this happens, the problem is that the poor countries will actually become more poorer, and the rich countries will become more richer, right? So what should happen is that there should be some kind of restriction. There should be some kind of government intervention to reduce this problem as well. So yes, the international trade is good, but then the problem is that some countries or some developed or rich countries also dominate the global demand for export of natural resources. And if they dominate that, other countries in the world, there are so many countries in the world, they may import from those developed nations instead of importing from these poor countries. And that actually increases the gap between the rich and the poor. So yes, we know that international trade is beneficial, but then there are severe or a lot of disadvantages of international trade as well. And that is the reason. And there's an economic conflict involved, right? Yes, we have advantages. Yes, we have disadvantages. That's an economic conflict. And that's the reason why countries, they introduce policies such as tariffs and quotas to restrict international trade, and so that they could protect their domestic production. They could protect their domestic production, protect their domestic firms, protect their domestic employment, protect their domestic incomes from increased competition from overseas producers and overseas firms, right? So remember, guys, this is what you are going to write, and also remember that there's another problem with free trade as well, that free trade may also result into over specialization. So let's say developing economies, because we said that you should specialize in where you have a comparative advantage or absolute advantage. So for example, poor countries, they should specialize in, maybe let's say developing countries could specialize in agricultural goods. But the problem is that globalization has resulted into things changing in the world. Your tech and your service sector is growing. And if you over specialize in something, then you become dependent on it. And if the world changes, the global economy changes, and if there are structural shifts in the economy, right, and the consumer demand moves towards from the agricultural goods to more of the manufacturing or the tertiary sector, then in that case, you will be at a loss because your industry is so much used to producing agricultural goods only. So it would result into huge levels of unemployment, plus it would result into huge levels of occupational immobility as well, because your labor is so much over dependent on you producing agricultural goods, right? So you could also mention this point in the exam as well. So I think that's it. I would like to end my video over here, and I hope you enjoyed the video. I'll see you all around in the next video where we are going to be discussing the different methods of protection. Okay, guys, see you all in that video. Until then, take care.